So I guess we're going to start now. So it is a pleasure to introduce Alyson van Raalte. She is a research group leader at the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research in Germany, Darmstadt, Germany. So she's a demographer by training and has been doing a lot of work along the lines of determinants of health and mortality, and more recently promoting the idea of moving a little bit away from just life expectancy as an overall indicator and moving more into the idea of lifespan inequality, and including more social factors and other indicators with the computation of lifespan inequality. And that's what she's going to present today. So please join me in welcoming Alyson. It's the first time she's at UCLA. And she just landed from Germany last night, so I hope she has a good time. So, yeah.
Not jet lag. Thanks for the warm welcome. Thankfully, we're not too late in the day, so it's still not too jet lagged just now. And the blue skies really help too.
I wish we had regular daylight in here.
Oh, that's true. Why don't you do your seminars outside? Is it always 18 and sunny? This is just incredible. So please feel free to interrupt me all the way through. I'm not sure how many of you really are demographers, and so this is a very demographic talk. I know one that's obviously easier if everyone understands what I'm talking about all the way through. But I'm very happy to be here and to talk a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing with my research group in Rostock. And generally, as Karan said, we are really pushing this idea of looking beyond life expectancy and also looking at lifespan inequality. And if this is a new term to you, I'll start by explaining just that. Okay. So here we have the non-Hispanic black and white and male life table distributions depicted over age, and this is the percent of deaths. And normally, in the population health, we summarize these distributions with the life expectancy of birth. As you can see, whites have higher life expectancy than blacks. But these distributions also have other qualitative differences which aren't getting summarized, and that's the variability. So there are many ways to describe this variation, this spread in ages of death. I myself use different terms all the time, which probably is very confusing. So throughout this presentation, I will use lifespan inequality, lifespan variation, mortality compression, which is the idea of compressing deaths into a shorter, a smaller age interval. Sometimes you hear rectangularization of the survival curve. That's the same concept as the survival curve. That LX curve gets more and more rectangular in shape. That also leads to deaths being compressed into a narrower age interval and declining lifespan inequality or variation, age of death variation. Okay, so what I'm talking about exactly is this spread. So one way of summarizing that would be the interquartile range. That's sort of the simple way because it's sort of intuitive. That is basically taking the distance between when the 25th percentile of deaths occur lined up by age and the 75th percentile. And if we look at this difference, for black males it was 22.1 years, and for white males it was 18.8. If you actually look proportionally at the differences, proportionally the difference in lifespan variation is actually higher than the difference in life expectancy. Okay, so
could you go back for a second?
absolutely.
I'm confused by your labeling.
Okay.
It's 2012 to 2106.
20,
What you actually mean?
Sorry, that's 2016. Thank you for pointing that out, yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, so that's just a few years aggregated, so the distributions are a little smoother, but not quite so many years.
So those are deaths that occur in that 5-year range.
Exactly. So that's,
Okay.
yeah, exactly. All the deaths divided by all of the exposures in that age range in a period manner. Okay. So recently we made this argument in Science in the Policy Forum section, and we argued precisely that we need to start looking beyond means and looking at variability. So we can think, okay, well, it sort of seems to me, a little bit intuitively obvious. Why aren't we doing that now? Why isn't this being regularly done? And I think there are three main reasons why we have, up until now, not really looked at variability. The first and sort of the main reason is that it's not always clear that there actually is an added value to looking at variation. Maybe if you look at life expectancy, you get enough information. Why do we need to go deeper? The second reason given is that it's not also clear which indicator of variability to use. We have all sorts of them. We showed the interquartile range on the last slide, but we can use standard deviations, Gini coefficients, there's absolute inequality, there's relative inequality. What do we really want to measure when we want to measure variability? And then the third argument, I think, is that variation is already a little bit more of a complicated concept to explain to the general public. And because of this complication, maybe it's just not necessarily worth it. So I will go through all of these arguments and say that I actually think we should be looking at variability. So the first one, this idea, is there actually an added value? The main reason why this comes into the fore is because there's a negative correlation between life expectancy and lifespan inequality, particularly when we are looking over longer historical periods. So as when life expectancy was lower, as it has increased, deaths have become compressed into a narrower age interval, and variability has declined. And in fact, if this correlation is so strong, then what is the added value? So to explain this idea further, here is the French male ages at death from 1970 to 1974. So again, 5 years aggregated. And then the life expectancy at birth was 68.6 years, right here. And if we fast forward to 2010, 2013, that life expectancy increased from 68.6 to 78.4 years. And the variability declined. So essentially what happened is that a lot of these infant deaths got redistributed over adult ages. And then there was also a little bit of pushing in this sort of premature mortality, particularly around this age as well. So it's not surprising then that the two measures are negatively correlated. This is how it looks if we look at all female life tables of the Human Mortality Database. Now this was a study done in 2005, so it hasn't really been updated. But these yellow lines, yellow dots refer to populations before the 1900s. The orange dots are from life tables between 1900 and 1950. And the darker dots are for populations after 1950. So if you're not familiar with the Human Mortality Database, that's a collection of mainly high-income countries. And I think about, I can't remember how many populations, maybe 30 populations in here, but obviously a lot of the populations only enter the database in these higher areas. And obviously, as we can see, this correlation is pretty strong. In fact, there was an interesting paper a couple of years ago in PNAS from Fernando Colchero et al., where they, instead of looking at lifespan inequality, they looked at the inverse, which is lifespan equality. So 1 divided by the inequality. And to make that line a little bit straighter, they did something which I think is a little bit sneaky. As you can see, it's tailing off a little bit at the end. So they put it on a log scale. And when you put it on a log scale, then you get a really strong correlation. And they also used a relative measure of variability, which does tend to be more closely correlated with life expectancy. But in any case, I think it's still a fascinating paper. I don't want to say anything too terrible about it. And the way we read these yellow populations, these are period life tables from 2013 for different populations, so Nigeria being the highest mortality population and Japan being the lowest. The dots refer to female populations, and the end of the tail are the males. So the men are kind of following the women, if you like. And the blue points refer to Sweden as over time, so period life tables over time. Here in green, we have hunter-gatherer populations. And in red, sort of crisis populations. So these are These are life tables that come from populations that have experienced war, famine, or epidemics, or I think the highest mortality population were the returned slaves in Liberia. But interestingly, when they also plotted non-human primates, who arguably don't have the same control over their environment as humans do, the correlation didn't really hold over these non-human primates. They weren't on the same continuum as humans. Yeah, so I could basically end this talk here and say, well, if we know this correlation, we know in the future it will just look like this, and then there is no added value. But I actually think we're now sort of in a critical point where this sort of a scenario might be equally plausible. And there are a few reasons for that. For one, infant mortality has now declined to levels that it's not going to change so much more in the future. So you won't have so much redistribution from infant mortality to these older ages. Secondly, we're now starting to see more and more midlife mortality crises. The United States is a perfect example, but also particularly among subpopulations just about everywhere. And then the third reason is that death rates at oldest ages are continuing to show pretty strong declines. So that's actually pushing out the right tail of the distribution. So as long as nothing is happening over middle ages, but mortality declines at oldest ages, that can also lead to increases in variability. Okay, so the first to really, or I think one of the more pivotal early pieces that made the point that we should maybe start looking at variability, that it is sort of showing us something interesting opposed to life expectancy, was a paper by Edwards and Tulge-Perker in 2005. And what they did was they conditioned variability on survival to age 10 to sort of get rid of this idea that infant mortality is just sort of what's driving trends in lifespan inequality. And there they showed that there were a lot of populations that were just completely stagnant from 1960 to the present. Although some other ones, like Japan in here, were still showing declines. I think this was Canada. And these trends are not necessarily reflected in the life expectancy trends, even if we condition on survival to age 10. More recently, in a paper in demography, we showed, Jose Manuel, that when we're only looking at the levels, when two things are moving in a certain direction, you're not necessarily getting at the actual relationship. It's actually better to look at first differences, to look at changes. And if we really expect this life expectancy, lifespan variation correlation to be so strong, well then it should also show up in first differences. It should show up in the changes, meaning that we would expect that an increase in life expectancy would be associated with a decline in variability in year-to-year changes. And what we found actually in populations that, so we looked at Central and Eastern Europe, which had a long period of mortality stagnation and then periods of crises, basically, that these correlations were not holding as we necessarily would have expected them. So in this period, 1960 to 1987, it was a real period of life expectancy stagnation. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't any movement happening at the age-specific mortality level. During this period, infant mortality was continuing to decline pretty much continuously. Working age mortality was actually increasing during lots of these periods, and old age mortality was declining. So we had very different patterns at the age-specific level, which were not really showing up in life expectancy. But when we look separately at lifespan variability, we're also getting a different perspective. And as a result, these year-to-year changes were actually showing up more often in the quadrants where we wouldn't have expected, as opposed to the quadrants where we would have expected. Now, 1980...
Could I challenge you slightly?
Yeah.
Or maybe I'm just anticipating.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, why would you be interested in the lifespan variation as a summary, rather than being interested in the age-specific changes or stability in age-specific mortality rates, I mean, which is just what you just said, is that
Yeah.
the
That it's masking. So of course, variability is another summary measure which also masks.
and what we
what's
care
happening.
about is those disaggregated levels. We care about the changes or stability in infant mortality. We care about what happens to the young adult or middle-aged adult population, and then we care about what happens to old people and maybe others in between. But that's sort of where the action is. And so why aggregate?
So I think I would give two arguments. The first is that we're already aggregating, we're aggregating with one measure, and that one measure is masking a lot. So if we have two measures, then we already can see sometimes when they're going in directions that we don't expect, that gives us an extra idea or an extra push to look deeper at the age-specific trends. And then the second argument I would say is that, is this a fair situation when mortality is declining over some ages and increasing over other ages? To me, that's a very fundamental inequality. And that alone has sort of a normative value.
Well, I agree with you about that,
So,
but you need to say, but you need to disaggregate it to say that. You need to say that.
absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. But when you see that inequality, is increasing, that's a sign that we need to see why it's increasing. And then when it's increasing, it's a sign that
Okay, if it's
mortality over premature ages is declining more slowly than over older ages. But I'll get a little bit more into that as I get into the age part, but I don't disagree, I think, fundamentally with what you're saying. Obviously, we need to look at more disaggregated information to be able to make any firm conclusions about any changes in mortality. Yeah. I think another example that's particularly interesting, because this is also looking at the population level, starting from birth, is just comparing Scotland and England and Wales. Both populations are part of the UK still. For now. And England and Wales has always had higher life expectancy than Scotland. But if we compare the two countries at the level of life expectancy as opposed to on the year, the distributions were sort of following quite similar paths, if you like, up until around the late 1980s. And then Scotland, as their life expectancy increased, did not manage at all to reduce its lifespan inequality. And when we look deeper at the reason, a lot of this was driven by, the heroin epidemic in the late 1980s in Scotland, and by a lot of alcohol-related mortality as well in Scotland. So very much behavioral-driven mortality, particularly affecting working-age male adults. Okay, and if I haven't convinced you yet that there can be differences if we just look at life expectancy. This is maybe a little bit of a, not necessarily the nicest style here, but German audiences love it.
Well, we believe it. You may not love it.
So where would you rather live? So Germany is actually also a bit of an example of an underwhelming performer in terms of life expectancy worldwide. It actually has the lowest life expectancy of the EU 15, even though it's an economically powerful nation. Unlike the USA, it hasn't actually seen sort of stagnation or decline in the last couple of years, but it has just sort of seen a long period of slower than expected life expectancy increase. However, so when we compare trends in life expectancy here, I've started from the year 2001, the proportional change in life expectancy was pretty similar between the two countries. But when we look at lifespan variation or lifespan inequality, I think in this case I looked at the standard deviation in life expectancy for in years of life. And in Germany, there was sort of a monotonic decline in lifespan variation in this period. So even if life expectancy gains were going at the same slow pace as the United States, it was still sort of this progression of mortality kind of compressing and the distribution moving to the right. In the US, on the other hand, the variability, trends and variation have been very different. So in the early 2000s, variation increased. A lot of this was actually driven by stagnant mortality and infant mortality during these years, which subsequently declined here. And then from about 2010 onwards, we've seen rises again, which has been really driven, I think, by the midlife mortality crises that have been very well documented in recent years. And so interestingly, lifespan variation started increasing much before life expectancy started declining. So I think really, so those are a couple of examples from national populations, and they're a little bit cherry-picked. I was picking populations of Central and Eastern Europe, the United States, Scotland, populations that have experienced a certain degree of mortality crises in the last 20 to 30 years. Thankfully, most populations are not in that segment right now. However, where I think the action is happening are among certain subgroups, particularly disadvantaged socioeconomic groups. So in our science paper, we showed for Finland, a population where we have this beautiful registered data that goes back from 1971 to the present. So this is a kind of study that we can't do in too many countries. And because it's register-based, we have the whole population. We don't have problems with small sample sizes. We looked at three different types of socioeconomic status. So education, where admittedly there's been an awful lot of compositional change, does make it a little bit more difficult to interpret the trends. Occupational class, so upper non-manual workers, lower non-manual workers, and manual workers. There is a fourth group called other that we took out because that one is also difficult to interpret. Sort of started out as farmers and turned into people still in education or people self-employed. And the third dimension is income quintile. So we only have data from 1996 onwards, but the advantage of income, of course, is that we don't have compositional change. We only have the same size groups over time. And what's striking is that the trends are pretty similar across the three dimensions of socioeconomic status. And if we were just to look at trends in life expectancy, we would see that there has been some divergence over time. But I think what probably pops out more is almost how parallel those lines are. So it almost seems as though the more disadvantaged groups are just sort of following in the footsteps of the advantaged groups a few years behind. When we look at lifespan inequalities or variation, I think a completely different picture is emerging. So here the lower education groups, the manual classes, the lowest income quintile, they're actually experiencing increasing inequalities or increasing variability alongside their increases in life expectancy. So I think this is very worrisome because I think there's sort of a dual interpretation of lifespan inequality. On the one side, it's just talking about the heterogeneity of these groups themselves. So it's showing that these groups are becoming more heterogeneous in their ages of death. And on the other hand, from the individual level, it's a marker of the uncertainty in the timing of death. So the upper classes are increasingly living longer lives and increasingly have a better idea about when they can die, when they will die. So this is, of course, enormously important when we're doing any sort of life course planning. From the society point of view, when you're trying to design retirement ages, to have an equitable retirement age, you sort of want people to be arguably dying around similar time periods. But for these lower socioeconomic groups, it's really a challenge because even if on average they're doing better, the uncertainty is widening. And I should mention that there's also been some work on education in the United States, in Spain, and in Denmark, which have shown similar patterns. Except in the United States, the low educated are also experiencing declines in life expectancy. Okay, and we also looked at a measure of area level SES. So this is, in Scotland, they have taken postcodes and looked at the various socioeconomic levels of the area. So, for instance, car ownership levels, the number of people that are higher educated, etc. I don't remember all of the criteria that go into these, but basically they make a ranking, a deprivation ranking of all postcodes in Scotland, and then they group the populations into quintiles of deprivation. And so, of course, over time, areas can change in terms of which quintile of deprivation they fall into, but the idea behind this kind of a measurement is to think about these relative differences. It doesn't matter if you are living in a place that is more deprived than other places, and in that sense, it's the ranking that's important. And what we can see, this is a measure called eDagger, which is measure variability, and just like what we're seeing with the individual markers of socioeconomic status, the variability is declining among the most advantaged groups, and it's increased, well, it did increase among the most disadvantaged groups, although there does seem to be perhaps again a little bit of decline. And for females, there's certainly been some widening, although most of the groups do seem to be experiencing a little bit of decline in variability. And I didn't show it here, but all of these groups are experiencing increases in life expectancy. So is this a universal pattern? So this is sort of some of my work in progress that I'll be showing for the next couple of slides. And I think we really, at this point, just need to start documenting the evidence. Is this something that is happening everywhere? So we're trying to get as many populations as possible to look at the trends in lifespan variation and life expectancy by level of education. So for that, I'm using this life path data, which is aggregated census-linked data across a bunch of different European countries for as many censuses as possible. So our Finnish data can go back as far as the 1970s. Most of the other populations, we're only picking them up from about the 1990 census round. I've also included US data in this study. So Isaac Sasson he's now at Tel Aviv University. He, together with Mark Hayward, has done a lot of work using vital statistics data. It's not linked, so there is more uncertainty. However, you do have full populations. And the education is categorized into 3 groups. In the UK, it was only possible to put it into 2 groups. And we use the ISCA classification, but in the US, we used a different classification. So mainly because the US education system is quite different from Europe. So in Europe, I think the categories were less than high school, and more than high school, whereas in the US, I think it's high school, some college, and a college degree or higher. Now, because the study was started by epidemiologists who tend to have different needs from demographers, unfortunately, the setup was not what I would have liked. They took people at the beginning of the first census in 1990 who were aged 30 to 34, and then they followed them through different censuses. Each time picking up new individuals at 30 to 34. But unfortunately, if you're familiar with the Lexis diagram, this means that we're missing the bottom right triangle. So because the censuses are 10 years apart, we can really only start our analysis at age 40. And of course, we do know that their social patterning of mortality below age 40 is even higher than it is above age 40. And the other main problem is that the data are aggregated into 5 age categories, with an oldest category of 85 plus, which falls below the modal age at death for the most advantaged populations now. This makes it a bit challenging to get variability, because the assumptions we make about disaggregating that 85 plus category can have a bit of an effect. And it's actually more important for variability than it is for life expectancy to get that curve right. So we used a non-parametric smoothing method called the penalized composite link model. It was a really nice model, but there is some uncertainty there, and the main uncertainty is, of course, you have to define a last age in order to make this non-parametric smoothing, and gets into a little bit of the debate about what happens at oldest age. Should there be a plateau? Is mortality increasing exponentially, etc.? So for the moment, we are using a final age of 115, mainly because that closely matches the human mortality database, which everyone says is the gold standard. But then the human mortality database uses a canister smoothing mortality at the oldest ages to impose a plateau. So there is some argument there. But nevertheless, we've looked at different oldest ages, and the trends are qualitatively similar. So this is the picture for life expectancy across these populations that we have included in this study. Finland, you saw before in the previous study. It's basically the same data. And the question was, are these Finnish trends being seen everywhere else? At least for life expectancy, I think the pattern is quite similar. Finland does seem to have a little bit more divergence than some of the other countries, but Norway seems to be experiencing a similar amount of divergence, and the US maybe even a little bit more. The gray lines are what's happening with the national population. Okay.
What is the low?
So low educated, medium educated, high educated. So like I said, low is for the most part below high school, and above high school. But as I said, in the US, rates are slightly different. And then when we look at lifespan variation, so I'm using two measures here, looking at absolute variation, which is measured in years. So I think in this case we use the standard deviation. And in most populations, so I think pretty well all of them, apart from perhaps Switzerland, we're seeing divergences between socioeconomic groups. And it does seem to be the case that when we look at this absolute variability, the low educated group are experiencing increases in lifespan inequality, even though from the last slide we saw that most of them are also experiencing increases in life expectancy. Some of them are a little bit shaky here because those are smaller populations. And when we look at relative inequality, so this is, oh, sorry, you have a question.
I was thinking about how you're thinking about this in terms of the increase in inequality among the low educated. In some ways, is it the case that just some of the low educated are gaining in health and life expectancy and some are being left behind? I mean, should we think about this negatively, or that, well, there's been some improvements among some segment of the less educated population, and in some ways that's a positive story? I'm just trying to...
So the group itself is so that is, I think, an important question. So the groups themselves are becoming more heterogeneous. So some are getting left behind, and others, I'll show you in a further slide. Once they hit a certain age, they actually don't look so different from the more advantaged groups. I think the question is, to the extent that these groups are homogeneous, I would argue that they're just exposed to a much greater range of variability, and this is going to have some knock-on effects. So if you're coming from a if you're a low-educated individual, the chances are you're probably interacting more often with low-educated individuals. You're probably even if you yourself are living a pretty healthy life, you might still be exposed to cousins, to neighbors who are experiencing more hardships, and this is probably factoring into your own uncertainty in the timing of death. I have another project I'm working on with a PhD student that's actually looking at sort of stratification in the age of death distribution, and just showing how just completely stratified they're becoming over time as well. So that's sort of the idea that if you're in these high educated groups, or these high income, or you're looking at high income groups, you're just not even being exposed to premature mortality any longer. The groups are, the amount of overlap between the distributions are becoming increasingly low. So that's the way I think about it. But I think certainly a lot more work needs to be done to be translating some of these macro indicators into what they actually mean to the individual. And I sort of think that's the next step where we need to see if these kinds of differences are actually playing into, if people are aware even that uncertainty is increasing among their surroundings in terms of ages of death. And I think if people are aware, I think that is a major source of uncertainty, a major source of inequality that we need to start measuring and that we need to start thinking more about. when we look on the relative scale, so this is looking at variability relative to life expectancy, the differences are not so as dramatic. They're still widening, but I don't think in any cases there's massive increases in inequality in the US, a minor increase in inequality among the more disadvantaged groups. And I think this is a normative question. So absolute inequality would mean the differences between ages at death, between individuals in years. You know, this person died at 50, this person died at 60, that's a difference in 10 years. Now, does it matter what their life expectancy was, or is the important thing just that 10-year gap? So does a 10-year gap when life expectancy is 80, does that mean something different than a 10-year gap when the life expectancy is 70? So if you think that it does matter what the actual background life expectancy is, then relative measures come into play. If we think that what matters more is just the number of years that are separating the ages at death, then we look at absolute inequality. I think this is a completely normative question. I don't think there is an answer, so I think it's dishonest not to look at both.
Well, you can ask people how they perceive.
So do you perceive a 10-year difference in life expectancy between two people in a low-educated group to be less problematic than between a high-educated group is really what it comes down to?
Yeah, I would ask it a little differently. Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do people know about the difference in variance in life expectancy themselves, or do only demographers know? And also, do they make financing decisions based on this?
I think this is sort of the next place we need to go. So as far as I've seen in the literature, there was one paper that came out in demography that used own survey data in France and tried to get at this exact answer. So to see, they called it subjective uncertainty in life, in age at death or something. So there have been a lot of studies that have been done in the past 20, 30 years that have been looking at subjective survival probabilities. So, you know, in the HRS, for example, they ask people, what do you think the chances are that you will live to be age 70, age 80? You know, there have been some studies that have shown that they're actually not terrible about actually predicting life expectancy. And that people do seem to make decisions based on these subjective survival probabilities. But I think the next question is to say, okay, so you think you have an 80% chance of surviving to age 80. I'm certain are you about that 80%? Is that, you know, that might be your best guess about where you're going to live, but what do you think the chances are that you would live to this age, or to this age, to this age? And as far as I know, there isn't any survey in the world right now that's asking those kinds of questions where you can really elicit those kind of responses. So this plot here is basically taking this data and just putting all of the populations together and looking at the relationship between life expectancy and life expectancy or average age at death. So because these are conditional life expectancies, so they're conditional on surviving to age 40, and the standard deviation. And you know what we would expect is this negative correlation. And we're seeing it very much among the high educated groups. Among the medium educated groups, it's a little bit more mixed, and among the low educated groups, there's hardly any correlation at all. But if we look at the different colors, and if we were to just take each of these as a snapshot in time, then there is still certainly a relationship. So this sort of means that in the cross-section, there's a little bit of a relationship between life expectancy and variability, but it doesn't seem to be holding over time within a population. Pardon me. And this is looking at the relative scale, and again, the correlations are much stronger on the relative scale, but the relationship is much tighter among the high educated than it is among the low educated. Okay. So the preliminary conclusions from this current study that I have is that the lifespan inequalities are diverging between educational groups across countries. The correlation between life expectancy and lifespan inequality is only strong for the most educated groups. And the correlation in the cross-section is stronger in the cross-section as it is in the temporal dimension, as I mentioned. So if you had any comments on that part, I would really appreciate that too, because as I said, this is sort of work in progress. Okay, so that's just a little bit about the correlation between lifespan inequality and life expectancy. So what are the drivers of lifespan inequality? Let's look at some of the age and cause of death patterns. One thing that's important to note is that the sensitivity of life expectancy and lifespan inequality to age-specific mortality change is quite different. I probably should have included a plot on that, I didn't. But lifespan inequality is very sensitive to infant mortality, and it's also more sensitive to things that are happening at the tails. So it's quite sensitive to premature mortality. When I say premature, I mean sort of working age mortality. And it's quite sensitive to mortality that's happening at older ages compared to life expectancy. But it's not so sensitive to mortality change that's happening around life expectancy. Whereas it's sort of the opposite when we look at the sensitivity profile of life expectancy. Reducing death rates at around the life expectancy is actually where you will have the biggest impact on increasing life expectancy. And so as a result, the causes of death that drive changes in life expectancy tend to be different from the causes of death that drive changes in lifespan inequality. So this was a paper by Benjamin Seligman, Greenberg, and Joseph Berker in PNAS. It came out a couple of years ago, and they showed that they looked at different causes of death and showed that, for instance, circulatory disease was having a huge impact on changes in life expectancy, but actually its impact on the variance in mortality was pretty low. In some populations, it's having up and down patterns, it's flat. And the reason is that when you reduce mortality from circulatory diseases, you're sort of reducing it at both these younger ages and these older ages, and it's not really having an impact on the variability as a whole. On the other hand, cancers do tend to have a younger age profile of mortality. And so reducing cancer mortality has had a very strong impact on the variance, but less of an impact on life expectancy. Yeah?
Sorry, I just don't understand these figures.
Okay, so on the x-axis we have the change. This is cumulative over time. I can't remember when the start and the end periods were. But when we see movement in this direction, this is showing, we read these linearly, so every year how much reductions in circulatory disease is increasing life expectancy. And so by the end of the period it would have been 5 years. And how much it is changing the variance in age at death is on the y-axis. So if we take this point, which is Japan, declines in circulatory disease mortality in the beginning had a pretty strong impact on the variance. And then with the life expectancy, the variance started increasing, and life expectancy started increasing as a result of these changes just in circulatory disease mortality. We look at, where's the United States in yellow, the declines in circulatory disease mortality, so accumulated over time, have actually led to an increase in the variance in age at death of about 20 years in variance of the squared, a bit of a hard measure to get your head around, but about 6 years of life expectancy gains. And so this one is maternal and child mortality. That's for males, that would just be infant mortality or infant and child mortality. And the declines in infant and child mortality have led to about 2.5 years of life expectancy gains, but had an enormous impact of a decline in variance of 150. And the scale, I don't totally love this figure, partly because the scales are different across each cause of death as well, so it's difficult to make kind of comparisons and to know necessarily. But I think the point is mainly just to show that for reducing lifespan inequality, the main causes of death are, of course, maternal and child mortality and injuries, so homicide mortality, suicide, etc. Infectious diseases, a little bit less so. Well, depends. So Japan had huge changes because that was following it in a period where it went through much of the epidemiological transition. Nowadays, the infections are low enough that it's not.
So
been passing things too much. Yes?
So just to clarify, the
Yeah.
maternal and child mortality causes of death are children's causes of death as well as maternal death?
I think they just kept the same category, because I'm only showing males here. They
No,
have the
I
same
know.
figures for females, so they group together maternal causes that were causing maternal deaths.
And
Two women
children's
and-
causes of children?
Exactly, exactly. So for males, obviously, you have to be maternal. They just didn't change it. I should have shown the female. So, I don't know.
No.
why.
That part I'm not worried about, it's just why
Yeah.
are you grouping together children and women and their causes of death? It's okay, it is what it is.
It is what it is. Yeah, exactly. I wasn't on this paper.
Well, maybe it's totally dominated by the infant mortality.
Yeah.
Well, for
There's
males,
almost
but
no
then
maternal mortality.
why add the maternal mortality in for females?
Yeah, I think because maternal mortality was a pretty big contributor to infant and, maternal and child mortality, and they probably just didn't want to have another example of maternal mortality. Would be my guess.
Okay.
I don't know. But I kind of agree. It's an odd category. It had an odd categorization. And, yeah. Okay. So to talk a little bit more about why these different causes are having different impacts, I sort of tried to explain it a little bit, but maybe it's easier to show graphically. So here we have the German age of death distribution from 2017. And if we save lives in these ages, we get mortality compression. So here I've reduced mortality from ages 0 to age, I think, around 60 or 70 something. And I reduced it by, I don't know, I can't remember what I picked, 5%. And then on the other hand, I just reduced mortality after this age by a certain percent for each age, and that leads to mortality expansion. And then in between, we have this threshold age, where if you save a life before the threshold age, you get the compression. If you save a life after that age, you get the expansion. And this threshold age depends a little bit on the measure, but it's usually just below the life expectancy. And so, of course, the causes of death that are happening over these ages are the ones that are going to be really having a stronger impact on lifespan inequality, whereas the causes of death that are happening around the threshold age, like circulatory disease, do not have that much of an impact on lifespan inequality. Yeah.
Thinking about this, so the inequality measure seems captures two phenomena that are somewhat different from a welfare point of view, I guess. From my point of view, keeping me from dying in young ages so that I can make it to old age in half, right? So there's something like the expansions and so like you don't want that kind of inequality. The inequality that where you're pushing life outwards, that comes from some kind of technological process.
Yeah. So I this is a
tree or something. I don't know how to say it.
Yeah, so I think this is sort of another argument why maybe it doesn't have too much of a normative meaning on its own, lifespan inequality. But my argument would be, well, why are you having declines at older ages that are outpacing the declines at younger ages? So for inequality to decline, it's not just about one or the other. You have declines happening hopefully at all ages.
No, but
And it's looking at
you could have increases in mortality in old ages, inequality would fall.
Yeah.
Not sure. I mean, do you think that's a good thing? I mean,
That one's a little bit trickier, but normally if we think about declines, I guess I tend to think of it more in terms of comparing the ages at which declines are happening and the pace of decline. And if we're having declines, as I said, happening slower at older ages or faster at older ages, so then this is changing our levels of inequality. But you're right that it's quite clear the normative implications on the premature mortality. But if, on the other hand, if we look at how lifespan inequality has been changing and is continuing to change, it's really these changes that are happening over the early ages. So these, in this particular study, so you saw these points earlier. this particular measure of lifespan variation, which is called Bldg, or life disparity, it can be decomposed into contributions before and after the threshold age, and they sum to be the final amount of lifespan variation. So, for example, when we have an Bldg, which is, the interpretation is the years of life lost due to death, or the average remaining life expectancy when people die. So if someone dies at age 10, they might have 70 years of remaining life expectancy. If someone dies at age 90, they might have 2 years of remaining life expectancy. We sort of average this out, and as people die in narrower and narrower intervals, the difference between the age at which they die and their remaining life expectancy becomes shorter and shorter. And so this early lifespan variation is the years of life lost before this threshold age, so the years of life lost over these ages. And this late lifespan variation are the years of lost after this age. So this remaining life expectancy weighted by the number of deaths. And the trends are pretty much dominated by the early lifespan variation. And this is looking over a long calendar period. But if we look again at our Finnish data that I really love to play around with, here we have the premature mortality component. So this is the life years lost before the threshold age and at various levels of remaining life expectancy. And among the manual workers, the increases, they experience increasing variability over these premature ages, whereas the non-manual workers experience continued declines in variability owing to mortality decline in these premature ages. Now, just because variability is increasing, it doesn't mean that mortality is increasing. It just means that the contribution of mortality decline is leading to wider distribution. Yeah.
So I guess the thing I was stating kind of related to your previous graph, and basically, instead of having like some kind of threshold that we chose for what's early, so maybe you can track like the 25th percentile on the 50th percentiles of this distribution. Because in some sense, like, even if percentile is stated that would be 50, but 25 is not easy, but that kind of generally resolves the question.
Yeah, no, and there have been some percentile approaches done. I'm not necessarily against that at all. I think that's very, yeah. And then what you see here is that what's happening above the threshold age is very similar across the population groups. So it's just very dependent on their level of overall mortality, and basically once people of these different socioeconomic groups hit a certain age, they're experiencing the same mortality patterns as the more advantaged groups are, just maybe a couple of years behind. Yeah, and we can also start looking again at some nice crisis populations. So here we have Venezuela, I think from 1996 until 2013. Since 2013, I think the data are basically non-existent, so it's tough to know what's happening in more recent periods. But life expectancy increased by 1.5 years during this period. If we only looked at life expectancy gains, we might think, oh, that's not so terrible. But when we look at what was happening, there was huge, the contribution of these middle ages to life expectancy gains, what would have actually led to a decline in life expectancy, and these red bars are homicides. And as I said, there's different sensitivities of the two measures. When we look at lifespan inequality, well, these increases in mortality from homicides are leading to increased variability, but then these declines in mortality that were also pretty substantial at older ages are also leading to increased variability. So on the whole, apart from the major declines that they still experience in infant mortality, most of the other causes of death are above the zero line. So most of the other causes of death are really leading to increases in variability in Venezuela. And since was here, I had a study that he was involved on. And this is in Mexico. And this is showing by state. John can correct me if I'm wrong here, but in the north, sort of closer to the US border, the contribution of homicides to changes in lifespan inequality. And so there are two different periods here. These dots represents for the period before the major war on drugs, and the triangles the period afterwards. And the changes in mortality, I mean, this is looking at, this is contribution. A year, this is again, this remaining life years, or life years lost due to death measured. So a year of remaining life expectancy was lost due to death in some of these states just from homicide mortality alone. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you then that this doesn't need to happen. We can also experience this, and because of that, I think there is added value in looking at a measure of variability. So returning to this earlier slide. So the next part, which indicator should we use? Well, we already talked a little bit about how relative measures and absolute measures, that seems to be the biggest bifurcation, that the relative measures are more highly correlated with life expectancy. On the other hand, the correlations between measures themselves are pretty high. I don't think this is something that we should get totally hung up about. Maybe we just use a couple of different indicators of variability. But it depends a little bit on the audience. If we want to measure that's more interpretable, if we want to measure that has really nice demographic decomposition, and I think that will differ from one study to the next. And we listed just a couple of the different indicators that can be used for lifespan inequality. From statistics, we have sort of spread indicators like the interquartile range or percentile-based indicators, variance, standard deviation, coefficient of variation. From economics, the Gini coefficient, or the absolute Gini coefficient, which in survival actually has a really nice interpretation because it's the average difference in age at death between any two individuals randomly picked from a population. From information theory, we have entropy indices, most notably the tile index, and then there are a couple of life table-based indices. So I've already talked a little bit about this life disparity. Yeah.
The indicators in the statistics side, how do you account for changes in the age distribution, or is it based off of the life table?
It's based on that life table age at death distribution that I've shown a couple of.
So that's also after you do the life table, you.
So let's go back to one of those. Here, let's go back to here. So to calculate the standard deviation, basically it's the age at death. So let's take age 60, for example. You take age 60 minus the life expectancy, which is, say, 78. You would square that. You would weight it by the number of deaths. Then you would take the square root of that. And then divide it by the life expectancy. Now that's the coefficient of variation, so it's just like that. Yeah, so it's a spread. It's basically getting at that spread here from these ages at death. Okay. Yeah. And then the last issue is, yeah.
Sorry. So if you have a age at death,
Yeah.
isn't the age of death, if you have a data set of all the deaths that happen in their ages,
Yeah.
isn't that kind of influenced by how many people are in each age group?
Yeah, that's why I've been using life tables.
I see. So the
So if you-
statistics ones would not, if you were to compare over time.
You can also do it from an actual age of death distribution, but then when you're looking at trends,
Yeah.
there's always the question, you know, are these trends being influenced by changes in the age structure, or are they being influenced by changes in mortality? I think that's the same argument with life expectancy. That's why life expectancy is usually calculated from a life table. Even though it's following an artificial cohort, no one will actually experience these death rates if you think about the period sense. But at least when we compare across populations, we're comparing apples with apples in a sense. So it's the measures that I have shown, all of the graphs that I have shown are based on the exact same life tables that would be used for life expectancy. And it's not based on actual ages at death. The other thing I should mention is that all of the figures I have shown you up until now are based on the period dimension. The cohort dimension is also interesting. But we can look at it a little bit for the national populations, but we certainly, where most of the action here that I've been showing has been happening at the subnational level, and unfortunately isn't really available yet, unless we truncate the cohorts. Okay. Yeah, so is lifespan inequality understandable? Does it have normative importance? These are important questions. At least in economics, I mean, nobody talks about the average income in the country. Well, they do talk, we have the GDP for the average, and then we have the Gini for the inequality. And that's kind of become very standard. I think if you ask the average layperson, how do you calculate a Gini coefficient? Nobody knows. But they know that high Gini is bad, low Gini is good. Maybe it could be the same thing for these measures. If we start measuring the Gini coefficient in survival, knowing that a high Gini is showing that ages at death are becoming more varied, that's all that they really need to know, not necessarily to understand the mechanics of how it's calculated. I don't know. Then there is the second issue about, that Adriana already mentioned, that, well, if we increase mortality of the old people, inequality declines. Is that a good thing? And I think my other argument would be that it's just not really something we're observing. So these changes in inequality are not being driven by old people's mortality increasing. So when we are seeing these changes, they're dominated by changes in premature mortality, and it's good to have an indicator that is very sensitive to these premature mortality.
I guess the counterpoint is that a Gini coefficient, while hard to explain the math, is very intuitive to explain. People may not know what it is, but if I were to tell them and say a 1 means one person has all the money, and a 0 means everyone has the same amount of money, I think that's pretty quick.
Okay.
Whereas this...
Well, you could say 0 means everyone's dying at the same age. Higher number means people are dying at different ages. The more people are dying at different ages, the bigger the spread in age at death, the bigger the giant Gini. I don't think that's so complicated.
I mean, the difference being that, right, the numbers are never approaching... I mean, to me, the counterpoint would be this versus a rectangularization measure, which have been used a lot. And the nice thing about a rectangularization measure is you can sort of leave out the, if someone's lucky enough to live to 114, no one sort of begrudges them that. I mean, maybe because there's not like a Mike Bloomberg of London. I mean, there is Jean Comment, but she's no longer with us. There's the distributional form of this takes the right skewing that exists in an income distribution does not exist in a mortality distribution. So a rectangularization measure ignores that part and simply says what proportion of years are being lost relative to that sort of moment of distributional moment of that identifies what is a good life in this society at this time, and that may be more intuitive, which is how many years is this society wasting relative to what is a good life? And I know that this is a empirically more slippery concept relative to standard deviation, but it is also more, in some ways, more digestible to consumers.
Well, to some extent, I don't necessarily see that there is such a huge difference between a rectangularization measure and a variation measure, because they are basically one and of the same.
Well,
one's working from the survival curve and one's working from the age of death distribution.
That's right. One has 100% as the target, and the other has a number attached to it, a years of standard deviation.
So if you were to say 100% is the target, that means that everyone dies at the same age.
No, because again, you could still, a rectangularization measure can still have people varying. I mean, you can do it. You don't have to do it relative to a total, the maximum lifespan. You can do it relative to a moment in the lifespan distribution. That is, or you can just set it relative to an absolute target. Right, whatever. But normally, the way I've seen rectangularization measures used is they say you take it relative to that inflection point, right, in the survival curve. And you say relative to that inflection point in lifespan distribution, here's the proportion of years that are being lost in relation to that, and that is calibrated to 100%, whereas the disadvantage of standard deviation, again, it's mathematically more correct, but that I don't know whether 11 is good or bad as a standard deviation. It's not a, it's not a, not making a
just trying to
case,
think
I'm
about
just
it.
throwing it.
Thinking, to me, higher standard deviation is bad, but this is
Well,
maybe
but bad, how bad?
how bad
is
it is,
standard
okay.
deviation? That's, and how much?
Because you don't have a reference population, is what you mean.
And how much is going up? Is 11, going from 11 to 12 back? If you
Okay.
said we were wasting 11% of years and now we're wasting 13% of years.
Mhm.
Again, even though you would have to calibrate it to a made-up target
Mhm.
or a target that is this weird moment on the survival curve, that would not be meaningful to anybody. The resulting, outside of this room, the resulting, that it would be an intuitively appealing target. It's a trade-off. That's a trade. That's a trade-off you have to face when you're in this world of
Yeah.
I'm not talking about means. I want to talk about distribution.
Mhm.
What's the way to sell this?
No, I haven't thought about it in that sense, but I think you're probably, there's certainly a kernel of truth in what you're saying. Yeah.
And you're right. The math is almost identical, but
Yeah.
how it's sort of what you spit out.
Yeah.
Unlike if you were doing this sort of say league table.
But I think in that case it sort of also depends on the level of detail you want to get. The disadvantage I see using the survival curve or the rectangularization is because it is bounded. It is less sensitive to changes in mortality. So in other words, you have to have really large changes in mortality to move the survival curve precisely when the survival curve is getting to the right. So in that sense, you lose the ability to pick up small changes in mortality. Again, you have to be really large changes in order to see a movement in the survival curve once the survival curve becomes very rectangular. However, if we look at the distribution of deaths, because they're not bounded.
But then that gets into Jenny's space where, to some extent, a rising standard deviation might be good. If that's that you're swinging.
And for me, that's the problem with some of these indicators, which is I'm not sure the right reference point is the mean.
Right.
When we get the average, we're getting the standard deviation with respect to the mean. But when we get to older ages, my point would be, is the mean the reference point? Wouldn't it be the mode?
So I would say,
For instance, because the mode would represent the age at which most people will die. And if I'm an older adult, that seems to me a more relative reference point rather than the average.
I would say from a societal standpoint, it's the private sector's job to move the distribution to the right. It's the public sector's job to make sure everyone gets to the inflection point. And that would be one, I mean, that would be one way to split the difference. It's very narrow.
I was gonna say. Very American for you.
But that, I mean, there would just be one way that would be, either way you could say that the left of the inflection point, right of the inflection point are, that solves that mean problem. Because then you are at least saying that the source, where the action really is not in the mean, the action is really at the point of, at the inflection point in the rectangle.
Mhm.
Right, and on the same point, I'm not sure we want to look at the inflection point.
Mhm.
I'm not sure that's the point of reference, because if we look at the survival curve, the inflection point is what she was referring to, the threshold age.
Right.
But that threshold age moves, and the threshold age usually is below the mean, which at that point I'm not sure the mean is even the most relative point of reference.
Well, that's why I was saying look at the
why everyone does
percentile.
this.
Right,
Because
so-
in some sense, the lower percentile, you want all of them to be going up. The upper percentile, well, if they go up, then good.
Right, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
There was on percentiles, there was a really nice paper that also came out in Finnish by Bldg's group, and they looked at, they were more interested in older age mortality, and so they called it the traveling wave. I don't know if you saw that. Basically showing that if you looked at fixed percentiles above age 65, that these have been really steady over time, and the traveling wave, the distribution moving across time. So I think that's a really nice perspective. And I think, one of the other big challenges but it's not just lifespan inequalities, it's also the same for life expectancy. It's particularly when we're looking at these socioeconomic groups who are truncating, because you need to wait to a certain age, in order to even have a socioeconomic status, and this truncation age is kind of, the number of deaths that are happening before the age are quite different from each socioeconomic group. So I don't think it's as big of a deal when we're looking at, say, ages 30, 40, but if we're thinking about inequalities in retirement lifespans, the number of deaths that happen before retirement are meaning that these different groups are quite different. And so if you're looking at the variability after that, you're already, it just makes the interpretation a little bit more difficult because there's so much of a selection story happening beforehand.
I'm sitting here thinking I want less aggregation, less summary, less summary. And what about simply presenting the curve, the age-specific death rates, and say a median? Median is a better measure, I think, than a mean any old day, from an interpretive point of view. I mean, obviously, mathematically it doesn't work very well, but from an interpretive point of view, you say, everybody understands it. This is the point at which half the people live longer. But it's the curve that's interesting.
But how do you, when you have a lot of populations that you want to summarize this over, you have different subgroups and it's one population over time, males, females.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously you have to decide what is presentable without getting lost in the weeds. But, you know, but the crucial things are things like gender and socioeconomic status, one measure or another.
But I think
Rural, urban.
some of the questions you're asking, though, are these questions, and this is where you're right. This is where it gets complicated, because some of these questions you're asking are these patterns universal? Are, is this happening to a lot of societies at the same time? Has it changed over time? And that's where the summary measures become crucial but problematic. I mean, summary measures of inequality are always problematic. But, I mean, you're right, Don, you can go down and look at them, which is what I always do, questions, but they're not going to answer some of the questions because they're going to be lost in between.
No,
Yeah, okay. I mean,
so, I guess to summarize, basically, why do we need a new measure? I think we've talked about basically everything on this slide already, but when I think about why we need metrics, I sort of see that there's sort of four major reasons. We use them to set health targets. So, life expectancy should increase by 2 years in the next 10 years. Maybe we should also be setting a target about variability. The target of variability should be declining. We use them to monitor the success and failure of different policies. So, one nice number to say this policy of, I don't know, introducing free Obamacare has led to this increase in life expectancy. Well, should we be monitoring Obamacare in terms of inequality as well? I think so. Comparing health populations and to uncover emerging health threats. And so I think that, I sort of see life expectancy as a measure of the speed of mortality decline, and lifespan inequality is a measure of the equality of mortality decline. I think that's another way of maybe thinking about it.
Let me ask another question, very, very simplifying kind of question, and not some of them not limited. So one way that people who look at inequality often do it is to look at the lower or upper tails. And so it seems to me with regard to mortality, what we really want is to improve life expectancy, but we don't necessarily, this is your point, we don't necessarily want to reduce inequality. What we want to do is shove the distribution higher. So we want to, maybe the two measures you want are life expectancy, but then also, I don't know, something about the lowest tail, moving the lowest tail up. Because you don't care if, it's equally good to have the higher tail part move up too.
So that's a question. If we look at, say, we look at premature mortality,
Right.
Just to challenge you a little bit here.
Yeah.
Say we pick a measure of life expectancy between the ages of 10 and 65 or something like that. Is it important to know what's happening at older ages? If we see that there's been a moderate improvement But would it make a difference if we knew that there was a major improvement above age 80 versus just also a moderate improvement? So I think the nice thing with this is that it is summarizing over all ages,
Yes, sure.
so it is giving this sort of full perspective.
I'm
But
just thinking
you're
that's
right.
your policy indicator though.
Mhm.
Because policymakers, what they really presumably think makes sense, want to move life expectancy up, but they want to specifically move it faster in the lower part of the distribution.
Mhm. And that's what this would measure. So you're seeing if you have both measures,
Fair enough.
I'm not arguing to just, you
Yeah,
see
no, you're right.
declines in variation and increases in life expectancy, then that means that premature mortality is declining faster than old age mortality.
See, but from my point of view, this is way too abstract for policymakers. Policymakers don't want to increase the lower part of the distribution. They want to reduce infant mortality.
Well, that's true of some policymakers, that's true.
But, or they want to, if you look and see, there's lots of, there are lots of, just for example, northern Mexico, there are lots of deaths of teenagers or young adult men due to violence.
Yeah.
Mhm.
You want to reduce that. And it's very concrete.
But
It's
you
not
also-
about distributions, it's about specific,
Well, but you also want to reduce
populations.
mortality at middle and older ages.
So I'm going to just show you the next
But
slide
that's
here.
another program.
yeah, that's, you want to
Systems
reduce
function.
cancer, you want to reduce flu deaths among the elderly,
Yeah,
among
I'm
the
thinking
frail
healthy
elderly.
people 2020.
Hmm?
I'm thinking about this healthy people 2020 that would come out with.
Yeah.
But I mean, we do talk a lot about inequalities by SES, and that's just one way of measuring inequalities. This is another way of measuring
Right.
inequalities. So, I mean, you're kind of pushing back, but then you say, so why measure inequality by education or income or anything else? I mean, there's a way of measuring inequality without taking
So predefining
a
social group.
predefined category, right? So, I mean,
Yeah.
Well, SES is another predefined category.
no, I know, but so would you say it's not interesting to track inequalities in SES?
No, of course it's interesting.
Well, then I'm
That's
just saying.
That's his whole life.
No, his,
My pushing back is that to some extent this is serving the same similar function. You don't, in a lot of data sets, you might not actually, say to go back historically, you might not even have measures of SES. But obviously this inequality measure would pick out underlying SES differential, even if you didn't have it.
no.
So I'm just,
I think his point is that a single summary measure
Sorry,
is there to summarize effects across a kind of a wide range of processes by age and cause. And his point is there's only about 4 age cause clusters that are really the target of policy effort, which is child, maternal, youth violence, and adult. And that you could just, and given that, and those, in the real world, those policymakers focus on those issues, unfortunately don't talk to one another.
Yeah.
And
So I think
sad reality.
my argument is that if we start looking at 2 measures, then we're already going to be, when we see that they're not moving in the direction we want to, that's going to give us that first alert. So let's look at this declining life expectancy that we're having in the US. That only started happening right here, but let's look at where it started happening. The lifespan inequality was much earlier, so 2010.
but is that always a leading indicator?
Well, lifespan inequality is going to be very sensitive to premature mortality. So when we see that lifespan inequality is increasing, I think that forces us to dig down. And then I think that maybe pushes us to see that, hey, what's happening if we look at the different ages? And if we look at the different ages, which ages are going up? Oh, well, that's age 30. And so you can see the declines in mortality across different age groups in the US are very uneven. And so if you're looking at the mean and you're looking at variability, and they're not moving necessarily in concordance with how you would expect them to, then you might have a chance to uncover things that you wouldn't necessarily have uncovered if you just have your little policy group working on child mortality, your little policy group, and there's no policy group that's actually specifically focused on mortality in age 20 to 30, for instance. Of course there is now, but I don't know if there was in the early 2000s. It wasn't on the radar of anyone. And so age 30 is interesting. This here is HIV/AIDS, and it's also crack cocaine epidemic, and this is opioids. And both of those things got picked up. Lifespan inequality.
I'm sorry I missed the first part of your talk. Is there anything, have people looked at this and how it relates to like cognitive health? So like, I'm thinking right now about like our presidential candidates, for example. Like, well, everybody's talking about heart attacks and all this stuff, but they're not talking about like, are they in the mindset? What is their brain like? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And how does that affect, you know, like Alzheimer's and dementia, and like as people live longer but are less cognitively.
So you would think that it could be interesting to look at how the variability in cognitive health is changing as opposed to just sort of mean levels of when people are experiencing cognitive decline.
Yeah.
So for instance, yeah, I mean, I think variability could also definitely be pushed more in the health sciences. I've only been looking at mortality so far.
Yeah. I just want, like you were saying opioids and all these other things, I was just wondering like how cognitive health prevents us capturing, you know, because folks are living longer, but maybe how are they living, you know? Like,
I mean, this is, everything I've been showing is only looking at mortality,
Yeah.
so it's,
Data.
but.
yeah, exactly, yeah, you're right, yeah.
I have started a project where we've looked at, you know, obviously it's also interesting to look at variability in health outcomes, but health is a more complicated concept because usually we have prevalence data. And finding variability in prevalence doesn't really make sense. So then we can look at incidence, maybe incidence data. So we played around with the first hospitalization and we used the Danish registers. So the ages at death and first major hospitalization, which we define as a hospitalization of 2 years or more, to try to get away from some of the problems that you have over time of different things, you know, being seen as inpatients and different things having actual admittance. And we find also there that there's been a bit of an increase in the variability incidence of this first hospitalization, first major hospitalization after age 60. So we also used a little bit of a washout period before, I think 7-year washout period before, to make sure we could kind of capture this. But health is much trickier than mortality. No, everyone knows that. Yeah. Okay, so that was basically, I think, all that I wanted to sort of say today. I think, you know, basically, there are these two phenomena that are really going to perhaps change the relationship we've seen in lifespan inequality. So this mortality decline shifting to older ages, and these middle life mortality stalls, all of which could increase lifespan inequality. And it's important to understand how all of these different factors are playing into changes in lifespan inequality. And I'm hoping that this could feed into some policies to look beyond just life extension and looking at the equality of mortality decline across different age groups. So, thanks for being such an interactive crowd.